Anthropophagy in the Andes, Tragic Crash and Triumphant Climb by Audrey
and Cassidy Schell.
In 1972, a plane crashed in the freezing Andes, bringing tragedy to the Uruguayan rugby team on board. It stranded survivors for 72 days with no provisions. Despite the perilous situation, the boys triumphed over the Andes to find help. The morals of standard society did not apply to this because the boys were trying to survive, and to triumph they had to do some normally immoral things.
On October 13, 1972, members of the Old Christian rugby team, along with some of their family and supporters, were boarding a plane that would fly over the Andes and land in Chile. During the flight over the mountains, the pilot lost track of where they were. He thought that he had already crossed the Andes and were over Chile. The pilot could not see the mountains still below him and started to drop altitude and turn north towards what he thought was their landing point, but was in fact the treacherous Andes Mountains. The aircraft hit the side of a mountain, shooting the back of the plane and any passengers in it out of the plane, killing them. The fuselage went barreling down the mountain, eventually coming to a stop at the bottom. After the crash, everyone surprised they were alive, but not everybody had made it. Including the people from the back of the plane, 12 died in the initial crash, and despite their best attempts to stay warm and attend to the wounded, 5 more died the first night from cold and injuries. Before the pilot died, he was repeating, "We passed Curicó, we passed Curicó," over and over. The passengers got a map and figured out that if the pilot was correct, the fuselage was on the very western edge of the Andes. They would not figure out he was wrong for 2 months.
The flight was supposed to take 1 hour, so there was very little food on board, and at 3,570 meters elevation, there was nothing alive. The small amount of chocolate and liquor that they had to live on was gone soon. This was their only source of sustenance, and it only lasted them a few days on extreme rations. After 9 days, they all started coming to the realization of what they had to do to survive.
Carlitos, I want to eat the pilot.
Nobody wanted to say it, but they had to eat the only source of nourishment they had, the lifeless bodies outside the plane. It was the hardest decision a person could make, and it was even harder for some very religious survivors. Comparing it to communion helped a few make the choice to live. However, some still could not bring themselves to eat, and they did not survive. Before they made that first fateful incision, everyone that was still alive agreed that, if they died, they would want the survivors to eat their bodies to stay alive. In 8 days of searching an area the plane was right in the center of, the rescue planes from Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile never spotted the white fuselage, so the search was called off and the team was pronounced dead. The survivors did not think they were going to live in the Andes for very long, but they did not lose hope until they heard over transistor radio that rescue attempts had ceased. Even then, however, they did not stop trying to stay alive.
Survivors had to use their minds to withstand the perilous conditions without any good supplies. First, they had to figure out how to get water, for they'd die quickly if they had nothing to drink. They learned how to shape seat backs into trays that snow could melt on and be poured into bottles from. The second problem they had to face was the severe cold. They did not have many warm clothes or blankets, so they huddled together at night and used the fabric seat covers to help keep them warm. They also made snowshoes by strapping seats to their feet with buckles. All of these survival methods were true triumphs over the horrible situations that the Andes put them in. Eventually, however, survival and waiting was no longer enough.
Before the avalanche, there were 27 people left alive. During the black of night on day 18, the survivors heard a distant rumbling. It was an avalanche that came down incredibly quickly. It rolled and tossed the fuselage, filling it almost completely with snow and burying it very deep. Those that survived immediately tried digging people out and removing the snow from people's mouths. 8 of them had died from being suffocated by the snow. They used a pole from the baggage shelf to dig a hole for air. It took them 3 days to tunnel out. The avalanche threw them into a routine of basics, collecting food, melting snow for water, and drying things out. When the boys decided to try hiking out again, the 100-foot deep snow and the horrible lack of supplies made travel incredibly difficult. Eventually, they made snowshoes and walking poles, and found the tail on a long hike to test their abilities. They found a camera to take pictures, and batteries they thought could be used for the cockpit radio, but in fact it was impossible, and the hope they had put on the radio was lost.
The only way you go forward is because you can't go back.
Only 16 of the original 45 passengers are still alive, and the food supply is dwindling. All of the boys agreed that they had to try to climb for help, but Nando Parado was the only one willing to risk death and failure for the small chance of success. The only thing they knew was that Chile was to the west, and the pilot thought they had already crossed the border. The thought was that they would reach the top of the huge mountain to the west and see green valleys in Chile below. Nando was very determined to get back to his father, and he eventually convinced Roberto Canesso and Antonio Vistin to gather the courage to climb the mountain that they believed was the only one separating them from salvation. They were given bigger rations to prepare, and Carlitos made them a sleeping bag out of sleet insulation, fabric, and wire as thread for them. Finally, on December 12th, day 60 of their time in the Andes, they took 3 days of rations for the hike and started up a huge and steep mountain with no climbing experience or proper tools. The false summits almost killed their determination, but Nando kept them going. His mindset was, "I'll keep on going until I stop breathing." When they finally reached the summit on the first mountain, after 3 days of hard climbing, they were crushed to see only more mountains ahead of them, instead of the green valleys they had hoped to see. Nando decided that he was already dead, and he said to Roberto, "We'll die, but we'll die trying." They sent Antonio back down the mountain to tell the others the two of them would keep on hiking and climbing westwards towards Chile. They took Antonio's rations so they would survive longer. They ended up walking and climbing mountain after mountain for 10 days, covering 37 miles. The plane was actually much closer to the edge of the Andes on the east, contrary to their belief. At the time, however, staying on their path westward seemed the best choice. On the 10th day of strenuous hiking, they saw grass they could eat and were filled with joy and hope. This meant, however, that the little food they had left started to rot. They came upon a roaring river that they could not cross and stayed there for the night. The next morning, a man on a horse appeared on the other side of the uncrossable river, and it was salvation. The ranchers saw the horrible condition that they were in and threw a paper and pencil wrapped around a rock across the river, because they could not communicate over the crashing of the water. Nando wrote on it explaining who they were and what happened to them and asking for help. The man left and got the police, and soon after, the boys were directing a few helicopters to the crash site to save their 14 remaining friends. They were saved.
When they were recovered, the initial reaction of everybody, including the press, was wonderful. Cesar Chalone said, "It's a miracle they are still alive." Eventually, though, people started to wonder just how they were alive, and the horrible truth of the tragic things they had to do became known. Many people felt offended by their actions, and the word cannibalism became associated with the survivors. Many moral discussions occurred about these events, especially in religion. However, the Pope at the time and the Catholic Church supported them despite the backlash they experienced. The term anthropophagy better fits the situation, for cannibalism implies killing, religion, and ceremony. What the boys did to survive was right, because the survival was more important than the need to respect dead bodies or the simple social rule to not eat human flesh. Still, though, some ridiculed their decision and believed the boys should not have eaten the bodies to survive. The tragedy of the plane crash and what 16 boys had to do to triumph over it made news around the world in 1972. Today, there are many books, movies, and articles about the events that transpired. Despite the Beagle conflict causing tension between Argentina and Chile, both countries helped search for the boys, and the news of the missing plane and the survivors spread to many countries around the world. The crash and climb is an inspiring survivor story, and some brave souls venture into the Andes to see the crash site and the hike that Parado and Canesa made for themselves. There is a memorial at the site for those that died during the 72 days in the Andes, and the tragedy, along with the survivors' triumph, will be told for years to come.